Your voice, your opinion, your community. Fact TV, free speech protected.
Good evening, Windham County, and welcome to the Fact TV Candidate Forum. Tonight we're going to be questioning people who are running for the state Senate. We have four candidates with us this evening. We have Nadir Hashim, Tim Wessel, Richard Morton, and Wendy Harrison. We're going to be asking them a series of questions, and then we're going to begin with an opening statement, ask them some questions, and then have a closing statement. This is not a debate. It's a series of questions. We're doing this over Zoom, so the candidates don't really have a good opportunity to interact, but I'm hoping that they'll be able to let you know what they stand for and why you should vote for them. So let's start with opening statements. And we're going to start with Nadir Hashim from Brattleboro. And go ahead, Nadir.
Hi, thank you. My name is Nadir Hashim. I actually live in Dummerston with my family. And, I've spent my entire adult life working in public service here in Windham County. And, my hope is to continue doing that public service for this county. My first job here in Vermont was as a state trooper working out of the Brattleboro Barracks and then the Westminster Barracks. And, during that time, I traveled to every town in this county where I saw the real challenges that Vermonters face, whether it's opioid addiction, domestic violence, or poverty, or there's a very long list of the challenges that folks are facing here. And in 2018, I wanted to take my public service to the next level. So I ran for office. I served as a state representative representing Windham 4. I served on the Judiciary Committee. And during my time in the State House, I supported legislation to raise the minimum wage, create paid family leave, protect access to reproductive health care and abortion, and protect victims of domestic violence, and also address the opioid crisis. And during my campaign for state Senate, I've heard from Windham County voters all across the county about the top issues. And my campaign, my priorities have become to focus on housing, workforce development, and climate change. And most importantly, I want to make sure that we protect democracy and make sure that we have that we're able to carry on respectful dialogue, even if we have different opinions and viewpoints. So I also want to thank the other folks who are running in this race, and I want to thank the Fact TV that's put this forum together. So thank you.
Great. Okay. Tim, would you like to give an opening statement?
Sure. Even though it was a bit of a surprise, we decided just before we were going to do an opening statement, but that's cool. Yeah, thank you. Just to echo what Nadir was saying, thank you, Marty and Mike and Alex over there at Fact TV, and the amazing work that community television does. I served for quite a few years on BCTV's board of directors. So I'm very appreciative because there's getting everything out to the voters is so valuable to people, and they don't have to be watching live. They can be watching recorded. So very grateful to that. I have been working and serving in Windham County for over 20 years. I have served on the Brattleboro Area Chamber of Commerce Area Board, the BCTV Board, as I mentioned, for 11 years, finishing as president there. I was RTM representative, if you know what that is, in Brattleboro, representative town meeting. And now I am in the middle of, or actually at the end of 6 years of service on the Brattleboro Select Board. That includes I was board chair for the very challenging year of 2020. You might remember that as soon as we took office in March of 2020, everything went to what you see now, the Hollywood Squares approach of municipal government. I found it very challenging, but also very rewarding. and I really enjoyed my service. I continue to enjoy my service on the select board. Just a little bit about me. I have a 4-year-old and a 33-year-old, so I have sort of diverse parental experience, and a lot of that informs some of my priorities going in, and I'll speak to that a little bit later. So once again,
Perfect.
just thank you for inviting us.
Great.
Okay, thank you. Richard Morton, would you like to give an opening statement?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate Fact TV putting this program together and having a chance to discuss the issues that are important to Vermonters. I've been a resident of Vermont for about 30 years, same home, probably lived here longer now than everywhere else. We've been married, my wife and I. And I felt that the situation we're facing this year warranted stepping into the public arena, the political arena, because I think that the country's going in the wrong direction, needs to have a correction there. And I believe even though we are somewhat shielded in Vermont from some of the excesses of the rest of the country, I think the situation in Vermont, we're also headed in the wrong direction. I'd like to step in and help contribute toward a refocus. And I think I can do that. I'm retired from banking. I was working at a community bank locally here in Brattleboro and was there for over 20 years, 24 years. And I have some skills there that I think I can apply to the responsibilities that the legislature has in considering legislation and either new legislation or adjusting existing legislation, setting budgets, setting priorities, working with the executive branch and the other departments of government. And I look forward to the opportunity to do that. My background, I'm also a pastor. I'm a chaplain at a local assisted living facility on a part-time basis. And so I bring that, hopefully a heart of compassion to the table as well. And I want to be focusing on what we're leaving for our children and grandchildren. They're the ones who are going to be coming up and taking the reins of leadership. We need to make sure that we hand off the best possible Vermont to them. And I think that we need to make some adjustments. I think we need to go in a different direction. The supermajority in Montpelier is unhealthy, and I think they've shown that by some of the decisions they've made in their legislative priorities. I feel personally that we're all going to be rookies if we go there.
All right.
Whoever of us is elected.
Thank you.
I believe that. Okay, I guess I should stop there.
Thank you, Richard. Wendy, do you want to give an opening statement?
Yes. Good evening. Thank you very much for hosting this forum, and I really appreciate it being the forum format works really well so that voters can understand who we are, which is critical. And I think we do provide some interesting choices for the voters. I'm running for state senate because I know how to make government work for the people. I love Vermont. It's both modern and historic, generous and self-sufficient, old and young. And that brave little state isn't just a slogan, it's real, and I'm on board. Vermont is tackling climate change, housing needs, the opioid crisis, childcare challenges, reproductive freedom, and protecting democracy. That's a lot for a little state, and I know that I can help. I'm good at government. I have decades of effective experience in local and regional government. I've worked and volunteered with residents, businesses, property owners, taxpayers, elected officials, and regulators to get things done. If it's creating housing, managing economic development, protecting historic places, improving transit, reducing taxes, I've done it. I learned a lot from my work as manager of Bellows Falls and Rockingham, Vernon, and Winooski. They all increased my appreciation for the variety and similarities of our communities. They're very different, and then they're very similar. A long time ago, I chose to concentrate my career in local government because of how close you are to the people you serve. Vermont is special because you can work at the state level and keep that closeness. I'm proud of my record, but I don't like to call it my record because everything important I've accomplished has been as part of a group. I work well in a group at any level. I've had success at the top, at the bottom, in the middle. I'm proud of the endorsements that I've received in this election from both individuals and organizations, including the Vermont Conservation Voters, Let's Grow Kids, VPIRG, the Vermont NEA, Becca Ballant, and Laura Sibilia.
Time.
Okay.
That's time.
Is that it? Okay.
That's
That's
time.
it.
Yep.
Thank you.
I will continue this later. Thank you.
All right. Do you want to go with the first question?
Okay, so we are going to the first question, and I'm going to start with Tim. If elected, what would be your top 3 priorities?
My top 3 priorities, excuse me, for being elected. My first priority really is to rapidly study everything I would need to know to be effective. Set up systems of communication so that I can communicate to my constituents really well, and they know how they can reach me quickly and effectively. And I think that's really important. That's what has to happen first. It's what I really would like to sink my teeth into next is really to find the place I can be most effective to help relieve our child care crisis. I speak about this a lot. It's one of the main motivations for me to get involved and to run for the Senate. We lost our child care in that very challenging year of 2020 that I mentioned before when I became chair of the select board. My wife and I lost our child care for our 4-year-old, or I guess at that time he was 2, doing math here. And it was very traumatic because, childcare is so essential for working parents. It's no longer a world where one parent can work and the other one can stay home. Often 2 earner households are what has to happen with working families. And so we experienced that. We were lucky in that we banded together with some other families. We were able to lay the groundwork, at least, for another provider to come in. We lost a lot of our teachers, we lost some of our families, but we preserved that school. The next thing, I guess I'll just wrap it up soon, is that my next priority is really trying to work on the housing crisis here in Vermont. You're going to hear that probably a lot from a lot of candidates, and that's because it's really important. We have to have creative solutions to this. It's very market driven, and so it's a very chaotic solution to a very chaotic problem we have. One thing is that we can't rely on one-time federal funds like the ARPA influx of funds. That's going to be shutting off very soon, and so we have to find responsible ways to address the housing issue here in Vermont, which ultimately is going to be a town-by-town solution in a lot of ways.
Great. Okay. Moving on, Rick. If elected, what would be your top 3 priorities? Rick?
You have to unmute. Rick, you need to unmute your mic.
I can see him there. Rick, we need, the question goes to you, Rick, and we need you to unmute your mic.
Yes, my apologies.
No worries.
I would like to, one of the things I would like to do is to reconsider how we handle legislation in the legislature. I believe that we have 180 people sent to Montpelier in the 2 houses, Senate and the House, and each one, if they come with the 1 or 2 legislative priorities, even if they overlap one another, we're talking about layer after layer of paint on the statutes of the state. And some need tweaking, no question about it, but others probably can be relaxed, I think, in some cases. So one of the things I'd like to do is lobby for changes in the way legislation is proposed. When it's proposed in the first place, who prepared it, who wrote it, who contributed to it, what's the need, Why does the need have to come to the government? What community resources are there? How effective have they been? What jurisdiction has primary responsibility? How has local government handled this issue up to this point? What are other states doing? How can we evaluate the effectiveness of these other states? Some of this is done now, but I would like to make this a little more robust. Secondly, I want to address trafficking. I believe Vermont is evaluated, beautiful Vermont is evaluated with an F grade by an international organization called Polaris related to this issue. And I believe that the steps the legislature took to decriminalize prostitution in Burlington this last session, just this spring, was a huge step in the wrong direction. If you get one, you're going to get the other. You're going to have trafficking, you're going to have prostitution. They go hand in hand. And I think we went backwards, and I'd like to address that. And I think that's an important issue we need to address here in Vermont. Labor trafficking, sex trafficking. And the third one would be the process of declaring an emergency in the state of Vermont. I think actually Phil Scott handled it pretty well, but I would like to see an adjustment made so that after 90 days, the executive has to come to the legislature and present his case for extending the declaration of emergency. And it needs some buy-in from the legislative side. I think that's wisdom, because when the statute was originally written, you're talking about mudslides, ice storms, fires, perhaps, and some other kind of emergencies, not in pandemics, which last for months and months.
Perfect.
So those would be three areas that I'd like to focus on if I'm elected.
Wonderful. We're moving on to Wendy. If elected, what would be your top 3 priorities?
Thank you. Some of these priorities overlap, and because the actions are complicated. I've chosen to group them as the first priority is equitable economic development, which would include workforce, which includes housing and childcare and permitting. Then my second, which I'll discuss all of these, but I just want to make sure I at least say them, so if I run out of time. The second one is implementing the climate action plan, both the transportation actions and the clean heat actions. And then the third one, which is not at all the least, is to protect democracy by supporting town clerks and promoting confidence in elections. So then getting first to economic development, workforce development. Obviously, I'm sure everyone's aware that we have a huge problem getting workers for all kinds of jobs, and a lack of housing and a lack of childcare. Those are the two of the main issues and problems. I've worked a lot in housing. I think it's important that both the private and the public sector be involved in the solutions to housing. The public sector has been involved for years, and that will continue, but it shouldn't all be on the public sector. There's a relatively new program that the state has to provide funding to private landlords to bring units up to code, and I think that's really important, and that will be expanded, and I very much support that program. I support investing in training in the trades. That's something that the governor proposed. I think that's a really good step. It's not only important now for economic development, it's also important for these individuals' futures, because that can be a really good option. Not everyone has to go to college, and that's a good inexpensive, particularly when the state's subsidizing it, program, and you don't end up with loans, which is really important. Other housing issues, or reforming the permitting process would help in economic development and housing, and where businesses are located. And we can make permitting more predictable while still protecting the environment. The Act 250 process can be amended to accomplish its goals and also allow for more and better development that improves the current residents as well as future residents. Am I running out of time again?
You
Yes.
about 5 seconds.
Okay. Climate action plan, and maybe I'll talk about that later, and democracy are the other two. Thank you.
Wonderful. And not, oops, sorry, forgot to turn my alarm off. Nodder, if you are elected, what would be your top 3 priorities?
Sure. So, my top 3 priorities are issues that have been developed over the months of talking to voters from all sorts of different areas in Windham County. And those top 3 priorities are housing, workforce development, and climate change. Now, when it comes to housing, I think that the 2 angles that should be approached are looking at Act 250, and as Wendy had described, making the permitting process easier, but also keeping in mind how we can protect the environment as well. And in my conversations with the Windham Regional Commission, the Windham and Winter Housing Trust, and the Windham and Winter Housing Trust, the other issue is also infrastructure. In a lot of our villages, one of the challenges is building out housing, but is trying to approach the process of building out housing, but without having that infrastructure in place. And so you need sewer and wastewater, you need the electrical capacity to build multiple units in a village center. And, I would hope to be a collaborator and work with the treasurer's office and communicate with towns about their different needs, because what works in Wardsboro may not work in Vernon or may not work in Dover, and find ways to, match funding or match grants or bonds to develop infrastructure so that we're not passing unfunded mandates to towns to develop housing. And I also want to look at further regulation for Airbnbs. I think that if somebody wants to enter a business, the hospitality industry, that's very important in our state because of the tourism industry. But I don't think Airbnb or Vrbo should be used as loopholes to avoid the regulations that we've had in place for decades for the hospitality industry. So I'd like to look at further regulation for Airbnbs and Vrbo properties as well. And workforce development. I'd like to look at creating more pathways to apprenticeships for different trades, and also expand the student loan repayment program for people who become teachers, nurses, or childcare providers. And I think that if folks get their degree and they work in Vermont for a year and they meet a certain income threshold, the state can pay off, let's say, a semester worth of their student loans. And that will encourage people to stay here for a longer time, develop roots, develop a social network, and be more engaged in the local economy and community. And when it comes to climate change, I'd like to look at increasing EV incentives and building out more EV infrastructure to make it easier for the average working family in Vermont to own an electric vehicle if that's what they'd like to do. And when we talk about climate change, I also want to make sure we talk about climate resiliency, because we are experiencing climate catastrophe. We're also experiencing people who are moving to Vermont to escape wildfires, to escape flooding.
And we're gonna have you hold that thought, because
Okay.
that was your 3 minutes, and so climate change, maybe we can bring that into one of the other questions.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. So our next round of questions are going to start with Tim. And Tim, we want to say, what do you see as the most important skills for a member of the Senate? And as a corollary, how would you demonstrate those skills?
Well, I have to say that absolutely number one skill that it takes up in Montpelier is communication. Not only, I would say, with constituents, because I mentioned that before, but communication with my fellow senators and representatives is absolutely key. Because with effective communication, that's the building blocks of finding common ground and establishing common facts. You can't build common ground without first establishing a set of common facts. And so that's all about communication. That's all about finding, even when you have diverse points of view, finding that overlapping area in a Venn diagram where you can begin to build on agreement. So I'm going to say that communication is very key And as an independent, I will not have a party in my ear saying, follow this line of dialogue, or don't promise this to this person. And I think that's going to be very valuable. Communication with the folks who elect me is key, of course. And I think if you ask any Brattleboro resident who has watched me for years on the Brattleboro Select Board, they know that my communication skills are excellent. I bring education to the mix. I'm not afraid of using social media to educate and alert citizens where their voice is needed the most. So I try to meet the needs of constituents where they're at, whatever communication forms they need. And I'm sure I've said the word communication a little too much in this answer, but that's basically it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Richard, the same question. What do you see as the most important skills for a member of the Senate, and then how would you demonstrate them?
Similar to Tim's comment about communication, but I would focus on the listening. I think it's important to hear all the parties who are at the table. I know that when the legislature gets together, they divide up into committees. The committees discuss legislation, and they meet around in a small room and around a table, and they have, you could call them witnesses, but you could have specialists or experts come in, and from a variety of viewpoints. I know this has happened. I've been there actually myself, and you can have others around the perimeter of the room taking notes and also contributing later on, either written or oral. Listening to all sides, hearing what people are saying. But I think it's important to also be thinking in terms of two other factors as far as the legislature is concerned. I want to focus on simplicity. What's the simplest way to solve a particular issue that we're considering? What is going to cause the least disruption to the people of Vermont? And then I want to look for unintended consequences. I want to hear what people are saying. I want to consider how they're approaching the solution, but I want to look at what could go wrong. What are unintended consequences to their proposals? And then look at each of the line items of the particular legislation under consideration and have that same approach. Listen to people and then look for simplicity and the unintended consequences related to the solutions being proposed. So I guess that would be a good summation of where I would come from.
Thank you. Wendy, the same question. What do you see as the most important skills for a member of the Senate, and how would you demonstrate them?
Great. Thank you. So your role in the Senate or in the House is to look out for the people as a whole and be future focused. The skills that are the most important, I believe, are collaborative skills, understanding complex problems, asking the right questions, being able to communicate with others, and establishing trust. I think it's critical to make sure that proposed legislation is necessary and solves the problem. And I've seen times when that is not the case. And there's a local example. When I was with Bellows Falls, the state had a program that was well-intended, probably still has it, to make sure that you have a safe water source. And at the time, the state was requiring that water operators, water utilities, duplicate the production facilities that they had. So in Bellows Falls, we still have sand filters. They wanted us to double the sand filters that we had in order to make sure that we would have an adequate supply. Now, because I had dealt with water systems in Florida, I knew that there were many other ways that you could solve that challenge. And we had already had those by storing water, which Bellows Falls has tanks, and you basically use the storage as a second supply. You can also manage demand. So I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but the point is that the state law at that time had a good goal, but it was too specific. And I'm in favor of legislation that specifies the problem and potential solutions, but then allows either towns or individuals who are going through permitting to propose alternatives to solve that problem. That would increase the creativity of both the private and the public sectors and get us to better solutions. And Bellows Falls saved a lot of money because they didn't have to duplicate those sand filters.
Good. Thank you. Nadir, same question. What do you see as the most important skills for a member of the Senate, and how would you demonstrate them?
Sure. So I think that the most important skill is having an open mind to different perspectives and new information. I think it's incredibly important as a legislator to remind yourself that you do not have all the answers. And it's also important to remind yourself that sometimes you might actually be wrong about some things. So you really have to have that willingness and ability to learn new things. You know, working in government and covering all sectors of government in your work requires absorbing a huge amount of information, and you're going to end up making critical decisions about these sectors of government that will affect hundreds of thousands of people and the thousands of people who pass through our state. And so when you're doing that, you need to have as much information as possible. So you'll have to be able to take a step back and say, you know, with this topic that we're discussing, I may not have a lot of information, so let me go find some folks who do, whether they're legislators, constituents, or organizations who work in that certain field. Perfect example is that when I served, people would often come to me for questions about law enforcement or the judiciary. And when I had questions about, let's say, solar panels, because I'll admit I have no idea how a solar panel works, I'd go to a legislator who does have that information. Or I'd go to a solar business in Brattleboro and I would say, hey, look, there's a bill on the table. I don't know much about solar energy, but I need to learn about it because I think this bill will affect your business. I think this bill will affect voters in Windham County. So I'd like to learn. And, you know, when it comes to being open to different views, I think it's really important to remind yourself that when you're running for public office, you have to remember that we're all running because we want what's best for Vermont. It's just that we have different ideas on how to get there. And we have to trust each other that we all want what's best for Vermont. And in order to do that, we have to reconcile our differences and figure out how we can create policy that will help the highest number of people in the state.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay.
You have the next question.
Moving on to the next question, we're going to get a little more, we're going to drill it down a little bit, and I'm going to switch up, and we're going to start with Rick this time. So Rick, what would you do specifically to help the citizens and businesses of Windham County?
Good question. Let me just mention first off that if I'm representing Windham County, I want to, of course, represent all of the citizens of the county, but I also take the picture into my heart and mind that I'm a senator in the state of Vermont. So I'm going to be looking at all of Vermont, not just Windham County, but I will be paying attention to what the citizens of our south east county are interested in. In order for me to do that, I need to know what's on their heart and mind. When I send out emails, I put my home phone on the email under my name. I expect that if people have something they want to say, that they will call, and I want them to be able to do that without having to go look it up somewhere in some legislative listing. So that's one specific thing, but that's just a symbol, really, of how I want to interact with the citizens of Windham County. I think particularly just going into the whole thought process that there needs to be a rethinking of the regulatory weight of government. I think we have over-regulated ourselves. If you think of a stallion with leg irons and ropes around its neck, tied down and staked out, that's one picture you could have of what government does, well-meaning, and maybe in some cases it was needed at a point in time, but how do you change for the flexibility for the future? So I want to have regulatory relief or at least review, and I think that would be significant if we went through our entire regulatory regimen over the course of 2 or 3 years, just take an area and work on it and say, do we need this? Can we simplify this? Can we still accomplish it in some other way that's less burdensome? That's what I would, and I'd like to listen to the citizens and the business owners of Windham County, the rest of Vermont, to get some input from them, whether it's by email, whether it's by phone call, however they wish to do that. You have to have an open door, open mind policy, and I believe I do. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Wendy, I'm going to ask you the same question. What would you do specifically to help the citizens and businesses of Windham County?
Yes, thank you. And I'll focus really on northern Windham County because that's your area, your service area. First, and I think it's really important that we ask them if they want help. Sometimes residents and businesses don't want help. So I think it's really important not to assume. And even though I was the town manager there, I don't assume that I know what Bellows Falls and Rockingham and Saxons River want now. Times change. So I think it's critical to ask people what they want. And actually go back a step and ask folks what their challenges are, because there may be different ways of addressing, there are always different ways of addressing challenges. So if you start at identifying the problem, you have a better, you have more of an odds of finding an appropriate solution or multiple solutions. I'd start talking with the town managers, the select boards, the trustees. I think it's really important that we have to inform and communicate to people what's available. What I found in small towns in particular, the state has resources, but the time frame can just be too tight. Sometimes you have a month to get an application together for a grant, and that's just not enough in the small towns. And the landlord assistance that I was talking about before, where private landlords can get grants of up to $30,000 per unit. I'm surprised that more folks aren't aware of that. And so the state really needs to do more communication on those kinds of problems or challenges. And then businesses have very different resources. And what I prefer to do with businesses is just walk around and chat. See what the situation is on the ground. Because I'll often notice things that folks may not even know that things could be different. But I find a lot out just by walking around and talking to people.
Perfect. Okay, Nodder, I'm going to ask you, what would you do specifically to help the citizens and businesses of Windham County?
Thank you. So I think that, literally every action that a legislator takes should be with the mindset that they are helping their citizens and the economy in their district. And, more specifically, what I would want to do is take a step back and focus on the fact that we should be able to provide people with the basics: housing, food, and clean water. I think that here in America, there should not be a single homeless person. Whether that person is a veteran, a refugee, or a person struggling with addiction, nobody should be in fear that they are not going to have shelter, access to food, or access to clean water. And, I think that if we want to have a thriving economy, the focus has to be on the workers and laborers who produce the goods and provide services to others. And to do that, I think we need to raise the minimum wage and include tipped workers in that as well. And also create a paid family leave program that the governor won't veto. We are a tourism-focused state, and especially here in Windham County, since we're essentially a doorway to Vermont and we have our ski mountains, I think that makes us a prime tourism location. And if we're going to support that sector of our economy, we also have to support the workers who run those businesses in these areas. And I don't want to be overly repetitive, but again, housing and also childcare policies I would like those to be a major focus if I'm able to return to Montpelier. And, moving beyond the talk of policies, I also want to repeat something that others have talked about as well, which is communication. I think that making sure citizens businesses and different organizations are able to communicate with myself and other members of the Windham delegation is extremely important. And, one of the luxuries we have in Vermont is, you can very easily, generally, get in contact with your legislators. You can see them when they're walking around downtown or grabbing their groceries. So they're very accessible, which is good. And so I'll just conclude by reiterating, communication is also very important.
Wonderful. Okay, Tim, you are up. What would you do specifically to help the citizens and businesses of Windham County?
Well, I think I started a trend with the communication being a strong theme tonight. And my colleagues are absolutely right. But don't worry, it's only half of my answer. The way our government in Montpelier operates is a mystery to most. So I would see, as half of my answer to this question as my responsibility to see that a large amount of education will be needed to really show my fellow Windham County residents how their government operates, help them plug into those moments where they can be effective when they want to lobby for something, an idea. And that's the key to making people feel represented. And I think I take that word representation very seriously. And I think it's very key to service up in Montpelier. The second part of my answer is that I am not afraid of good old-fashioned fiscal discipline. And I don't think you have to be electing a Republican to get fiscal discipline. My experience on the select board is that you must remember that the money that is before you when you create a budget is not your money. It's all of our money. And we have to be very responsible how it's spent. And I think Rick said something about unintended consequences. That applies to budgets very often. And I think that was a good phrase for him to use. I think I would be happy to call things out when money is not being spent effectively. And when it comes to businesses, I think that often what businesses need is that, like Wendy said, to stay out of the way sometimes. And other times they need assistance finding incentives and grants to help them be more successful. Or sometimes, like in Bellows Falls, really need somebody in their court to make sure the Vilas Bridge gets opened again. Have that dialogue with New Hampshire and make this happen. So that's what I thought about that question. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. I'm going to move on. We have an optional question that we were going to ask, and I want to go ahead and do the optional question, but I want to ask if you can do that if you limit your answer to 2 minutes. Mm-hmm. So then we can do the optional question and then do a 3-minute closing remark afterwards. So I'm going to start with Wendy, and I want, if you can answer in 2 minutes, what would you change, if there's one thing you could change about Vermont government, what would it be and why? Wendy.
Thank you. What I would change, if I had a magic wand, I would make it a home rule state instead of a Dillon's rule state. In other states where I've worked, they've been home rule states, which means that towns or whatever the local government is are able to do anything that is not prohibited by the state, as opposed to Vermont, which is a Dillon's rule state, where you can only do specifically what the state said you can do. So for local option tax, for example, unless you're one of the, I think 14 towns, Tim may know the exact number, you can't vote to tax yourself. So the towns who don't have a local option tax won't receive any benefits from the cannabis tax, for example, even if they have sales in their towns. And that really limits the creativity of towns, and it's much more over, that's more control than is needed. in Vermont. So the towns would be much more functional and the state would be a healthier place if we could make it a home rule state.
Thank you. Nutter, if you could answer in 2 minutes, if you could change one thing about Vermont government, what would it be and why?
Thank you. So Rick actually mentioned something in our last forum in Brattleboro that I do agree with, which is that government needs to slow down a bit. And I agree with that in certain areas. You know, right now with the way the legislature is set up, we have legislators have 5 months to handle the matters of the state. And halfway through that, around March, is crossover when Senate bills go to the House and House bills go to the Senate. And so realistically, a senator or representative will have about 2.5 months to do the research on their ideas or their goals, gather a coalition of people who will support that goal, and then get it across the finish line. And 2.5 months is a very small amount of time to deal with legislation that will affect hundreds of thousands of people. And, you know, there's one of the things that I learned when I was a trooper was that there's a big difference between rushing and doing something quickly or promptly. When you rush, you have a much higher tendency to make mistakes, things get overlooked, and problems happen. Now, of course, there are situations where you have to act quickly, like when we had COVID or when Hurricane Irene was here and we had to make emergency decisions. But I think, you know, going off of that, I think that we need to have a year-round legislature. I think that the issues that affect the state, they don't suddenly stop happening after May when the legislature adjourns. And I think that when it comes to a lot of these different, more complex policies, more time needs to be taken so that mistakes aren't made and we're developing policies that are more thought out. So that's my thought on what I would change.
Okay, thank you. Tim, 2 minutes. If you could change one thing about Vermont government, what would it be and why?
Well, since Wendy stole my usual thunder of going on and on about Dillon's rule versus home rule, I definitely agree with that sentiment. But I'm going to talk about something else. I'm going to talk about the thing that I would change, really, honestly, is that I would change the compensation system for our citizen legislature. And here's why. It needs to go up a little bit, whether it's adding some health care, that would be nice, and adding some funds, that would also be nice. But the way it is now, it's very difficult to serve. And I don't think anybody here would disagree with that. I can do it because I have a very unique situation. I work for myself. I do video production. It's not seasonal. So, but that would not work for 95% of the working people out there. And I do feel that this is a place where some raises would do a world of good. And I think candidates who are tied to a party are afraid of saying this. The fact of the matter is that when you pay your citizen legislature so little, you only get people stepping up who can afford it. And that's bad because then the people making the decisions about working people's tax dollars are people who don't have to work for a living. And that's bad. It's a class issue, and we need to talk about this more. I work for a living. I work very hard, so I won't forget what it's like while I'm a senator. But do you think all 30 senators can say the same thing? I honestly don't think so.
Great, thank you. Richard, same question in 2 minutes. If you could change one thing about Vermont government, what would it be and why would you want it changed?
Well, I'm going to be a little counterintuitive tonight. I'm going to actually suggest that if the power was there, that we'd shorten the interval for the legislature to meet each year. Originally in Vermont, the legislature met every 2 years to do a budget and maybe a few other things that were necessary for an emergency basis. And they met for a couple of months maybe, and then they went home to their farms and their businesses and their families. I'm not necessarily saying that we need to go in that direction, but the urge to add to the legislative session, to lengthen it, is just going to open Pandora's box. Well, let's see what else we can pass. Let's see what we can get done. Yeah, we want to do it carefully, but if we have the legislative protocol that I mentioned earlier in tonight's session, and that work was done before a bill was even submitted, then the hard lifting could be under analysis rather than doing that basic research. So I think we could get a lot done in less time. I'm not really advocating for a shorter session, but I think we need to think in terms of not so much how much legislation can we squeeze into this session, but let's do it right, let's do it well, let's do it thoughtfully, and look for those unintended consequences. So I guess if I had to pick one and I could fantasize about that particular change and had the power to do it, I would focus the legislature on what's really important, what's really critical, and the top priorities, and get those done, and let some of the other things fall off the table.
Okay, thank you. We are really tight on time. We're right on time. And if we could start with closing statements, 3 minutes apiece. Pardon me. And we're starting with Nadir.
Nadir, right.
Sure. So I'll keep it pretty quick. So I just want to share a very quick story. The very first day that I went up to Montpelier, each new legislator is assigned their seat. And, I had this assumption going up that Democrats would sit on one side and Republicans would sit on the other, the way it is in Congress in DC. And you can imagine my surprise when I got my seat. I sat down, I looked around me, and I was surrounded by Republicans. And I was pretty nervous at first. I'm not gonna lie. I thought there'd be a lot of headbutting. I thought it'd be really awkward. But in fact, it was actually one of the best things that happened to me. And the reason I say that is because, going back to what I was talking about earlier, over time we developed friendships and we ended up trusting each other, that we all were acting in good faith. And we asked each other hard questions. We didn't ask each other gotcha questions, and we didn't try to embarrass each other or anything like that. But when I would present a bill and I'd sit down, one of them would tap me on the shoulder and they'd say, "Hey, Nader, did you think about X, Y, and Z factor? You didn't mention this issue. So, did you do any research there?" And vice versa, when they would present, I would ask them the same questions. And the reason wasn't to make the other person feel like they failed at something. The reason was to refine policy and do a better job at making sure that bill or amendment did its job and helped more people in Vermont. And I think that ability to reach across the aisle and work with different folks. I mean, I've worked with progressives. I've voted with progressives. I've voted with Republicans and independents. And I think being able to carry on those conversations respectfully and with trust is a key component to making sure we have a functioning democracy that makes good policy. So my hope is to continue working for Windham County and to continue advocating for raising the minimum wage, providing paid family leave, creating more opportunities for accessing safe and affordable housing, supporting our workforce, and addressing climate change. And in order to do that, I'm asking folks for their vote on or before November 8th. We're pretty close to November 8th. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me by sending an email or visiting my website, which is hashimforsenate.com. Thank you.
Thank you. Tim, do you want to do a closing statement?
Sure. Thank you very much. And thank you so much again to Fact TV, Marty and Mike and Alex in the background there for all that work. I wanted to talk really quickly about the fact that my minivan has been all over Windham County so much, and it will continue to be rolling all over the place and learning a lot about the towns that I never before had an excuse to be spending so much time in. And when I'm out there, so many people, I have this rack card. We all have one. Here's mine. We all hand people a card, to sort of help explain things and to leave something with people. So many people, when I hand them that card or I say that I'm running as an independent, they say, "Oh, good." And it started to happen so often that I started to think to myself, like, why does everybody say that have that reaction? And because it's, you wouldn't think that Vermont would have that many independents, but the fact of the matter is that people consider themselves to be independents in Vermont. And they vote for the party because that's usually their only choice. So I really think that people yearn to be voting for an independent, because on a select board, nobody has a D or an R next to their name. You just roll up your sleeves and you get to work what's best for your community. And I will bring that spirit of independence to Montpelier. I'll be the only senator, as far as I know, I will be the only senator in quite a few years with an I next to their name. And I would be proud to serve Windham County with that I next to my name. And it's going to mean something. It's going to mean that I'm serving you, my constituent, not a party and not an agenda. And I ask for your vote on November 8th. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard, would you want to do your closing statement?
Yes, thank you very much. I thank you for Fact TV for putting this together. It's been a very good experience, and I'm very happy to be a part of this. I want to just mention that in the state of Vermont, we have an idyllic picture, and a lot of it's realistic. A lot of it's true. A lot of it reflects reality about our state. We're different from many of the other states around us, and maybe many other states in this country. But we do have issues. If you're a voter in Vermont, you're still connected to the nation as a whole. A lot of voters this year are not happy with the direction of our nation. And I believe that if they looked at the legislative output in this last several years, they would not be happy with that either. It's been said that all of us are going to be rookies this year from Windham County. There's no incumbent going back. Let me just make a pretty clear observation that any rookie Democrat is going to have to get in line to party leadership. There's going to be strong discipline in the party, and there's going to be pressure to toe the party line. That's what they do. That's what a supermajority does, and that's what we have now, a supermajority. An independent, with all due respect to Tim, either is going to conduct himself with the Democrats or the Republicans or shift back and forth. And if he doesn't do that, he's going to be basically standing alone. It's a great image of we have in our country of standing alone and being the independent voice. But the realistic situation we're facing is that we have to have 15 votes, 16 votes, or however in the Senate in order to pass legislation. And you're going to have to come up with those other partners to join with you. I encourage the voters of Windham County to go in a different direction, to change. Give us a try. I ask you to vote for Rick Morton, myself, and Rick Kenyon, my friend, who's also running as a Republican. We're voices of reason. I think you've heard me tonight, and he has a background in tax services for citizens. He's done for years. I think the two of us would be good representatives for Windham County. We listen, we work hard, and we're reasonable. Thank you.
Thank you. Very well. Wendy, you get the last word.
Okay, last few words. Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thanks to the candidates. And it's interesting to me how much we've really learned from each other, and I appreciate that. And I've learned a lot from residents that I've spoken with, to voters over these last few months, and it's been great in many different ways. I'm a big advocate for public transportation and other forms of non-automobile transportation, and I was surprised to find so many others felt that way too. I want to address the partisan discussion that we're having. This is my first foray into partisan politics. All of my experience in the town council in Florida was nonpartisan. Obviously, as a town manager, you work with folks who are all over the spectrum. I was appointed by a Republican governor and a Democratic governor to serve on the transportation board of Vermont. In economic development, you work with Republicans and Democrats and independents. And I'm proud to be an independent thinker, but I'm also proud to be running as a Democrat. I want to be in the room when discussions begin. I want to be effective. I want to be able to get things done. And I very much respect the power of government and the responsibility of government. And it's critical to have checks on that authority. That's what a big reason I want to be involved. We need more, just generally in our country, we need to understand the government can be a force for good, and in fact has been a force for good. I mean, the Clean Water Act is a great example of that, but that would be another 5 minutes. But we are in a crisis of confidence, and my goal has for my entire career and will continue to be demonstrating to people in ways that they can clearly feel and be part of that government can be a force for good in their lives and in their children's lives.
Thank you. I want to thank all of the candidates for being so respectful of each other and so respectful of the time. I feel very fortunate that we have such an intelligent, compassionate, dedicated, and respectful group of candidates that we get to choose from. I just am honored to be part of this, and I thank you so much for being here, but we are out of time.
We are out of time.
And I want to thank everyone for watching and thank everyone who put this on. That's it for us tonight. I'm Mike, and this is Marty, and we'll see you.